this week's episode, how to make sure you don't accidentally cut one of your own children out of your will. Wills and estates. The final frontier. These are the voyages of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Funeral. To boldly tell stories, intriguing, funny, sublime, and outrageous stories about estates. Decades before Star Trek, in 1942, Gene married Eileen Roxowit. They had two daughters together, Darlene and Dawn, and right after they were married, Gene shipped out. He flew the B-17 Flying Fortress in the Pacific in the Second World War. Skipping over the post-war years to 1965, still married to Eileen, in 1965, just before Star Trek aired, Gene was in a polyamorous relationship with two other women. Majel Barrett, who would go on to be Nurse Chapel in Star Trek, and also, interesting enough, in the pilot was number one. She was the executive officer in the original pilot. And also Nichelle Nichols, who would go on to be Uhura, the communications officer. Before you judge Gene Roddenberry's ethics too harshly, if you're prone to judging, consider some of his other ethos. Before Star Trek, just before, he had been offered a role writing on a show called The Riverboat, set in the 1860s in Mississippi. And the producers of that show insisted that there be no black cast members. Gene quit the show. He wouldn't do it. In writing Star Trek, Roddenberry had to push back against NBC, both that there would be a mixed gender crew aboard the Enterprise and that there would be at least a little bit of diversity. Nichelle Nichols and George Takei both got roles, which although minor roles, they were not based on stereotypes, which in 1966 was unusual. Roddenberry embraced the belief that in the future, human beings would be blind to race. Gene, I'm sorry, we're almost 60 years on and we haven't got there yet. In any event, Nichelle Nichols could see that Majel Barrett was deeply devoted to Roddenberry, and Nichols bowed out of the polyamorous relationship. Roddenberry and Barrett married in 1969, immediately after Gene divorced Eileen, who he'd been married to for 27 years, and they had one child, Rod. In Roddenberry's will, he was 70 years old when he died in 1991. His estate worth $30 million or more. In his will, he left each of his three children $500,000. Essentially, the rest of the money he left in a spousal trust to Majel Barrett, that she would enjoy the benefits of his wealth until she died, and then it would be divided up amongst the three kids. He included in his will an in terrorim clause, a threat. If anybody contested the will, they would be excluded and receive nothing. And Dawn, his daughter, did in fact contest the will. Dawn alleged that Majel Barrett had been a fraud, that Majel had unduly influenced Gene to leave the bulk of his money to her, and she contested the will. And then followed 2 years of leading up to litigation. 2 years of court proceedings, etc., etc. And the day before it was to go to court, 2 years later, Dawn withdrew her application. She'd let it go. Okay, go ahead, split up the will. But Majel Barrett decided to enforce the in terrorim clause. Majel Barrett went to court, and a California judge ruled in her favor. Dawn was excluded from the will. She did not get the $500,000, and she would not get the residual of the estate when Majel Barrett died. Dawn appealed, and on appeal, the appeal judge noted there was some evidence that this is not what Roddenberry wanted, that he wanted his daughters and his son to get his money. But, bound by the terms of the will, Dawn remained excluded. And the appeal judge was scathing in his criticism of the, and I quote his words, the lawyers and accountants for what they did. They took this man in his declining years, this talented writer, and they put words at the end of his pen. In other words, Gene Roddenberry didn't understand the possible consequences of the in terrorem clause. And the consequences were that his daughter got nothing. And you may be thinking, well, Majel Barrett didn't have to enforce the in terrorem clause. Yes, that's true, she didn't have to. But consider that for 2 years, Don had been calling her a fraud and a liar. Not only that, it also cost $350,000 in legal costs. No surprise, I suppose, that Majel Barrett held a grudge. The lesson: yes, get a licensed lawyer in your jurisdiction to advise you and assist you in the preparation of your will. But take the time to understand what you're signing. Take the time to understand the terms. Don't just let lawyers, instruct you and just sign off on it. Understand what you're signing. Fun fact, of the original cast of Star Trek, I have seen George Takei, James Doohan, and Leonard Nimoy speak live. Unfortunately, I've never seen Shatner. I would like to. Captain Kirk, you were my boyhood hero. And also, sadly, I never saw Nichelle Nichols speak live before her death, which is sad because Uhura, you were my first crush. I wrote to her in 1972, and I don't even know if she got my letter. And for everyone else, live long and prosper.